People are still going to be coming in from the waiting room into the main room, and we'll just let them in as they arrive. But I want to say welcome everyone, and thanks for attending today's webinar called Beyond Recidivism: Research on the Value of Post-Secondary Education Beyond Recidivism. My name is Kelsie Chesnut. I use she/her pronouns. I'm a research associate at the Vera Institute of Justice, and I'll be moderating today's panel. If I can get it to advance, there we go. Today's panel, to go over the agenda, we'll start with small group introductory breakout rooms. After that, everyone will return to the main room and we'll begin presentations from our guest speakers. We'll end the panel with a discussion and Q&A session. So we're really excited to have presentations from 4 speakers today. We're going to start off with Dr. Erin Castro. Dr. Castro is an associate professor of higher education at the University of Utah and co-director founder of the University of Utah Prison Education Project. She directs the research collaborative on higher education in prison, an evidence-based approach to expand the field of quality higher education in prison. Her research traces nationwide post-secondary education in prisons throughout the US and analyzes the use of criminal history in college admissions. Dr. Castro received her doctorate in education policy, organization, and leadership from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Katie Zuber. Dr. Zuber is the Assistant Director for Policy and Research at the Rockefeller Institute and Executive Director of the Institute's Center for Law and Policy Solutions. Her research examines the role of law in collective struggle with an emphasis on legal advocacy among sexual and gender minorities. She has worked on several collaborative projects featured in Law and Society Review, Justice System Journal, Political Communication, and Journal of Political Marketing. Most recently, she has taught as a visiting professor in the Department of Political Science at Skidmore College, as well as Union College, Vassar College, and John Jay. Dr. Zuber received her doctorate in political science from the University of Albany in 2017. Then we'll hear from Danny Murillo. Murillo has been named the Michelson 20MM Foundation's inaugural Smart Justice Fellow. In this role, he will cultivate a coalition to create a Bill of Rights that centers on the unique needs of justice-involved scholars as they persist and succeed in their higher education journeys. Murillo is a co-founder of the Underground Scholars Initiative at the University of California, Berkeley, a student organization and support program dedicated to supporting formerly incarcerated and system-impacted students in succeeding at the UC. He was a media representative for the California Prison Hunger Strike Solidarity Coalition and an advisory council member for the Vera Institute of Justice Safe Alternatives to Segregation Initiative. He was the research and program analyst at California Corrections to College, which focused on educational equity and creating access to higher education for currently and formerly incarcerated people. Most recently, Murillo was the program analyst at the Campaign for College Opportunity, and he's the primary author of their latest report, the Possibility Report, From Prison to College Degrees in California. Murillo received his bachelor's degree from the University of California, Berkeley in ethnic studies, and he is currently a graduate student at Cal State Long Beach, where his research focuses on the social and cultural analysis of education in urban and international contexts. And our final panelist will be Dr. Ayesha Boyce. Dr. Boyce began her research career earning a BS in psychology from Arizona State University, an MA in research psychology from Cal State Long Beach, and a PhD in educational psychology. Program evaluation specialization from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Boyce is currently an associate professor in the Division of Educational Leadership and Innovation at Arizona State University. She also co-directs the STEM Program Evaluation Lab. Boyce's scholarship focuses on attending to value stances and issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion, access, cultural responsiveness, and social justice within evaluation, especially multi-site, STEM, and contexts with historically marginalized populations. She also examines teaching, mentoring, and learning in evaluation. So we're really excited to have this panel today. Our panel is going to be guided by 3 overall questions. What are the harms of centering just reducing recidivism as the primary rationale for post-secondary education in prison, particularly for people of color? And what do we miss out on when we do that? What is the value or other impacts of post-secondary education beyond recidivism, especially from the point of view of incarcerated individuals? And how can we better evaluate and or measure these other valuable impacts? A few housekeeping notes before we get started. This webinar will be recorded, and a copy of the webinar and slide deck will be made available on Vera's website afterwards. We ask that you keep your mic muted when not speaking. We suggest that you use speaker view in order to see presenters as we go through the presentations. We encourage questions from participants. We'd like you to ask questions for speakers using the chat. My colleagues are monitoring this, and we will collect your questions to ask our panelists during the Q&A session. And we just want to encourage people to feel free to use the chat to also share information or ask questions of other attendees. To get you started, some of the prompts to consider are: what stands out to you about a speaker's comments? What questions does the speaker's presentation raise for you? And what would you want to know more about? And as a note, Dr. Zuber has a conflict later today. I will not be able to stay for the discussion Q&A, but we will provide contact information for all the speakers at the end and forward any questions that come up. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Castro to begin.
Thank you, Kelsie. Can everybody hear me? We're good. So I'm charged with leading us off today. And so what I'd like to do is pull from some previous work that we've done, kind of looking at the reduced recidivism rationale for higher education in prison broadly, and particularly through a lens of racism and white supremacy. I've included some pictures in this presentation today, all with explicit permission. And I've also tried to include a bit of landscape from Utah, since that's where I'm coming to you from. So if we could have the next slide, please. What I'd like to do in just the kind of few minutes that we have together is I want to ask the big question of what does justifying higher education in prison primarily via reduced recidivism? So this idea that we should only and insofar kind of provide higher education in prison insofar as it reduces recidivism. What does that do? And I'm putting forth three arguments that I've made in previous manuscripts. One is that doing so kind of cements what I'm calling a criminalized subjectivity. The second, kind of in line with one of our overall questions today, it severely restricts our vision, which has implications for all sorts of things. And it fuels a racist system that's inhumane. So I think the question then should be, what are the purposes of higher education in prison, which I think panelists after me will also touch on. And then finally, perhaps paradoxically, I'm going to just kind of leave us with a question of why we should care about recidivism, but that it should not be solely tied as the desired outcome for prison higher ed. Next slide, please. Just a bit about my framing here, being really explicit about how I approach this work. And this is, for anybody who's unfamiliar, this is Ben and Jerry, like on their website. I come at this kind of very explicitly as our current moment of targeted incarceration is a manifestation of slavery. It is a long line of kind of legalized confinement, pervasive discrimination based on race and class in this country. So a couple of years ago, we edited a special volume for critical education, and we were tasked with answering the question of kind of what does justifying higher education in prison via reduced recidivism do? And I want to be really clear, I am an education scholar. I'm not a trained criminologist. And so when I first came to this question, I was puzzled because recidivism is not an educational outcome. Recidivism is a criminological outcome. And so I kind of wanted to approach this question from that perspective of, if we were looking at any other student group in higher education, the question would not be, does it reduce recidivism? The question would be, what does it do? And then can we take those components and find out which ones actually contribute to recidivism, which ones actually don't? Next slide, please. So one of the things that we, co-authors and I in 2015 came up with is this notion of criminalized subjectivity. And essentially what that means is it's an answer to the question of, what does justifying college and prison via reduced recidivism do? And it creates this eternal criminalized subject. And so stick with me for a minute. If someone recidivates, they are a recidivator. if someone doesn't recidivate, they are no longer a recidivizer, but they still have that label on them. And so even if somebody participates in higher education in prison and 20 years later gets pulled over for a parole violation or something else, right? And they are charged, what relationship, if at all, does that have with their participation in a college and prison program? And why would we be concerned as educators about someone's kind of post-incarceration life in that way? It also positions incarcerated people as objects to be reformed. And I imagine my colleagues who are criminologists on this call are like, well, yeah, that's kind of what prisons do. Yeah, but it's not what higher education does. That's not the foundation of the enterprise. And so that should, for anybody who is deeply committed to the foundation of kind of public education for democracy or for equality or whatever those reasons are, positioning people as objects to be reformed should rub us the wrong way. I'll talk about that third one on the next slide. And then the fourth one is this idea that recidivism never leaves. So is, much like scholars discuss and activists and directly impacted people talk about the label of felon, for example. Recidivism is something that requires longitudinal tracking. And it does mean that somebody's kind of caught in this. And if we could go to the next slide. One of the things we argued in the paper in 2015 is that even amid higher education's best intentions, reduced recidivism as a rationale for access does not allow formerly incarcerated people to be seen as people, but only as criminals, either former criminals, reformed criminals, relapsed criminals, but always criminals. Next slide, please. The second angle here is that focusing solely on reduced recidivism restricts our vision for what's possible. And for anybody who's interested in evaluation and assessment, we know that we go looking for something if that something is what we care about. And so in part, one of the questions that I put forward here is, right now, the recidivism rates are alarming. What happens if recidivism is solved tomorrow? What's the purpose of this work? Should it still exist? Should we still have college and prison? I say yes. I know a number of you would say yes as well. And so kind of pinning everything on a particular, depending on how you come to this, I'm putting crisis in air quotes because some perspectives would say this is a deep problem. Other perspectives would say, no, this is a function of the system that we have, and this is how it was designed. So this does lead us back to the question of what should be the purposes of higher education in prison. And I will leave this to some of my colleagues who are going to talk about methodology later on. But I think what I will put forth here is in the very same ways that we calculate return on investment and impact, economic, social, political, cultural, emotional, in all those ways, we should also be tracking that for folks who are in prison and who transition out of prison. Next slide, please. Finally, this is from a paper that was published last year. We've talked ad nauseum at how the current targeted punishment system is a function of white supremacy. So too is the metric of tracking recidivism. When a disproportionate number of people of color, folks from low income backgrounds, folks with trauma histories are caught up in this system and then are perpetually tracked over the course of a lifetime. I draw from racializing surveillance, which is Brown's work here. It does mean that people of color post-incarceration are going to be disproportionately subjected to the kind of mechanisms of tracking recidivism. And as a higher education enterprise, do we want to attach ourselves to that system in very kind of important and impactful ways? It also furthers an individualistic notion of punishment and rehabilitation. And now, depending on how you think about targeted punishment in the US, we can't really, not everyone is in prison because they are inherently bad people. We all know this. And so when we kind of look at individual recidivism rates, we are solely relying on the individual to overcome all of the biases and discriminations that we know exist. And then pinning all of that back on the higher ed and prison program, which is beyond the scope of what I'm going to get into here, but it's absurd. Next question, please. Thanks, Kelsie. Or next slide. Thanks. And next slide. I'm going to skip this one. So I want to end with why we should care about recidivism. This was published 2 years ago in by our local NPR station. This is Tisha. It is the back of her, which I just want to point out, something that publications tend to do a lot. They don't show our incarcerated students' faces. And the title is Prison Saved My Life, Utah Inmates Seeing New Horizons with College Coursework. There are a number of problems with this. We did not sign off on this title, nor did Tisha. And I think this is the challenge that many of us face, at least one of them, in trying to do this work, which is not relying on the various systems of punishment to make this work possible. Tisha, anyone, shouldn't have had to go to prison to get what she needed. And there's a way that we can do this work where it makes that narrative a little too easy, and linking ourselves really tightly to recidivism also does that. So I'll end there and look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Next up, we're going to hear from Dr. Zuber.
Again, thank you for having us here today. As I mentioned or in the introductions, I am a researcher with the Rockefeller Institute of Government and also SUNY System Administration. I do unfortunately have to leave here today, but there are a couple of my colleagues in the audience, Tom Gaze, Rebecca Grace, and Rachel Sanders, who could potentially answer some questions about the research that we've been doing. Currently, SUNY is developing a statewide educational model that is going to allow students to start, continue, and complete college programs, and regardless of where they start their degrees and where they end them. And so getting a sense of how we can improve and expand on college and prison programs in New York, we have conducted a series of interviews, 44 interviews with about 47 different participants, including faculty and program administrators and formerly incarcerated students, to get a sense of what's working and not working in these programs. Just to provide you a brief overview of the existing programs here in New York State, we have a range of private and public programs. So private programs include Bard's Prison Initiative, Cornell's Prison Education Program, and also NYU's Prison Education Program. Kelsie, if you could go to the next slide. SUNY also has a wide range of offerings in this regard. So SUNY has approximately programs in approximately 20 of the state's 53 prisons. So SUNY actually serves about half of all of the students in New York State prisons. I think going back to, again, Erin's comments, we know that there's a lot of ways in this discussion about the value of college and prison. It often reduces down to not just recidivism, but other economic and financial benefits of these kinds of programs. So a famous study by the Rand Corporation talked about how people who participate in these college and prison programs had a 43% reduction in their likelihood of returning to prison. Other studies show that participating in these programs can also improve the employment opportunities that are available to people outside of prison. So another study by the Rand Corporation found that the likelihood of obtaining employment post-release is 13% higher for people who participated in these college and prison programs. Other studies find that they work a greater number of hours and receive higher overall wages. The discussion also tends to kind of reduce down in this discussion of potential cost savings. So again, Rand found that for every dollar invested in a correctional education program, taxpayers actually save nearly $5 in incarceration costs. So again, this tends to be the tenor of the discussion, but there's other ways to think about the value of the college and prison programs, not only from the perspectives of their students, but also their family members and the communities that they eventually return home to. So I'm going to look specifically at some of our interview data to give you a sense of what formerly incarcerated students say about these programs. So all of the subsequent interview data you're going to say is taken from actual students who progressed through these programs. So Kelsie, if you could go So for starters, again, we can think about the beneficial value to the students themselves. So one former student actually described participating in these programs as life-giving. So it offsets the intense kind of boredom and sense of purposelessness that people can experience in prison. It gives people something to do, something to focus on, other than the fact that they are in prison. So he described bringing work back to his dormitory, being able to spend the rest of the day doing that work and actually enjoying that work. He noted that students in prison want to be held to the same standards as students on the outside. So he specifically said, don't dumb it down. These students have more time than a typical student, oftentimes more motivation, and they want to be challenged and they want to excel. And these sentiments were really reflected in our interviews with faculty members as well, who said that teaching in prison was really rewarding because these were some of the hardest working, most engaged students that they had ever had the opportunity of working with. So one faculty member said, traditional students tend to see higher education as a route to a job, but these students in prison really think that education is liberation. Next slide. College programs also offer this connection to the outside world. So seeing professors coming in, sharing with them what was going on in the outside world. This particular student said, look, you can't take away from being in a prison, but college for this particular student kept his focal point on the curriculum and off what he later described as the politics of the prison environment. Next slide. Other people talked about the humanizing effects of these college programs. In the classroom, you're not just a DIN number, you are a person. That being addressed by your name can go a long way, that it instills a sense of pride and a sense of self-worth in an individual. And this is really important because we know that the way that people are treated in prison is also oftentimes going to kind of carry home with them when they return to their communities. Next slide. Students also talked about the importance of college programs as a source of empowerment. They're motivated not just to learn and to get good grades, but to become a better person. We can also see the ways in which prison programs affect not just the individual, but the prison atmosphere as well. A lot of research shows that college and prison programs actually make prisons safer and reduce violence because it changes individual behavior. And so this same young man who found such a sense of empowerment explained how his behavior changed. He became less aggressive, more focused on his short-term goals like his schoolwork, but also long-term goals like getting a degree and actually getting out of prison. You can go to the next slide. College and prison does more than just make prisons safer. It instilled this sense of camaraderie among students and even improved relationships between students and corrections officers. So one student described this sense of camaraderie that emerged. There's this no man left behind kind of dedication to one another. So students really supported one another and they looked after one another. They studied together, they spent time together. Oftentimes it was common for students who had been in programs longer to mentor some of the newer students and to help recruit students, encourage them to kind of avoid conflict and really invest their time and their energy in an education. Next slide. Other students commented, and this was not universal across the board, but mentioned that correctional officers sometimes actually became supportive, or at least were more willing to step out of their way when they saw that students were serious about their education. Again, wasn't necessarily uniform across the board. Other students described support among correctional officers as broad and varied, but again, it suggests that these programs can actually alter the perceptions of prison staff in ways that are positive. Next slide. There's also spillover effects beyond the individual and the prison. Having a mom or a dad or a sibling, somebody going to college, actually being able to see them walk across the stage and graduate can be a real source of pride and inspiration for family members. So One mom we spoke to said being in a college program really inspired her daughter to do better in school. We've also heard stories about students in these programs, parents doing homework with their kids. So one mother asked the prison program coordinator if she could get a copy of a book. And when the coordinator asked, why that particular book, it was because her daughter was reading it home and they were going to read it together. So this was a meaningful interaction, not only between the mother, not only for her as a mother, but also for her child. So a lot of studies, and this will, I think, subsequent panelists will pick up on where I'm leaving off here. We know a lot of studies focus on recidivism and employment, far fewer focus on the difference that these programs make in the lives of the students and of the family members and the communities that they return to. So there may be a lot of different ways for measuring and assessing these values of these programs, but I think this research in particular suggests that just sharing stories and talking to the people who experience these programs is certainly going to be one of them. So thank you, and I'll hand it over to the next person.
Great, thank you so much. Next, we're going to hear from Danny Murillo.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Thank you for being here. This morning, I will briefly describe some of the findings in the possibility report from prison to college degrees in California and follow up with some personal insight into what we miss when we only focus our research on recidivism. The report includes descriptive demographics on California's incarcerated and parole populations, including incarcerated and parole students. The report also contains a landscape analysis of current program offerings of public colleges and universities serving incarcerated and formerly incarcerated students. The most critical part of this report is the voices of formerly incarcerated students describing the barriers they encounter in California's public higher education system. I included a set of policy recommendations to dismantle post-incarceration barriers and create more opportunities, and concluded the report with an appendix containing a policy analysis of state and federal legislation making college accessible for currently and formerly incarcerated students. Next slide, please. In 2020, there were 127,709 people incarcerated in California's prison system. At the end of the spring 2020 semester, 11,472 incarcerated people were enrolled in a face-to-face or correspondence program, and 1,214 incarcerated students received a college degree. That's just about a little less than possibly like 10% of the incarcerated population that have access to education, right? From July 2018 to June 2020, there were 8,236 people released from state prison who were enrolled in a college course while incarcerated. At the same time, 595 people earned a college degree before the release date. Although California's public colleges and universities did not collect data on the number of formerly incarcerated students they serve, estimates indicated that in 2019, over 1,000 formerly incarcerated students were attending California's public higher education system. And there's a big disparity between the number of people released and the number of people that we were able to count on different campuses throughout California, right? There's about probably like a 6,000 gap of people, right, that were not accounted for. But we don't have no statewide tracking system, so we're unable to indicate like who exactly is in these programs on at least face-to-face, right? I mean, on campus. Next slide, please. I hosted 3 virtual focus groups with 29 students representing a cross-section of California's public higher education system. The focus group participants were diverse in terms of gender, race, and ethnicity, and they had an array of experiences accessing and succeeding in higher education. The focus groups included individuals in certificate degrees, associates in arts and science, associate degrees for transfers, bachelor's, master's, PhDs, and law degrees. Although our focus group participants had a diverse set of life experiences, 5 common themes emerged from all 3 focus groups. Parole and probation. California's parole and probation system do not prioritize higher education and often present barriers that keep formerly incarcerated students from achieving their educational goals. Housing. Many students shared that transitional housing conditions require that an individual cannot be enrolled full-time or they cannot apply for affordable housing because of their felony convictions. Employment. The need to work poses severe issues for formerly incarcerated students. Employment is key to maintaining stable housing, meeting basic needs, caring for family, and more than likely is a condition for probation, parole, or housing. Targeted student support. There are many steps a student must take before they even step foot on campus. That is why many of our focus group participants suggest that higher education support begins before the release while incarcerated. Students urge that support take the form of advising and help with transcripts, registration, financial aid, housing, mental health services, and legal support. Career transition. Due to their arrest and conviction history, formerly incarcerated students need expert and often legal advice to map out their career aspirations. Even after receiving their degree, formerly incarcerated students encounter barriers towards employment, especially if their chosen career requires a licensure, certification, or clearance. When the concept for this report was being discussed, I knew that I wanted to listen to people's personal experiences and understand the barriers they are encountering in their transition from a prison institution to a post-secondary education institution. Many themes emerged from these three focus groups, and the 5 I outlined were relevant to my research question. However, other themes emerged that are most often missed or not included in the data findings when we solely focus on recidivism. I recall a focus group participant discussing how her educational journey and the people she met along the way played an important role in regaining custody of her children. Another student discussed how formerly incarcerated peer mentors with institutional knowledge shared information on scholarships, fellowships, and paid internships, therefore making their college experience, it wasn't a struggle for them because they had access to funding through these programs. Collecting these narratives gives us a deeper understanding of the lives of formerly incarcerated students, the relationships and networks they build, and the social capital they accumulate. This is just one aspect of the overall experience. In my personal experience, I have seen the positive outcomes that higher education can have on a systemic to familial level. When I was released from Pelican Bay State Prison in early 2010, it was segregated by racial and geographic lines. During this time, access to higher education was non-existent throughout the California prison system. Fast forward 10 years later, when I returned to Pelican Bay State Prison as a guest speaker, I was speechless when I entered the classroom. I did not see the class divided by race, ethnicity, or geographic location. Higher education is blurring those lines and creating a community instead of division. Before my release from prison, my little brother and nephew were caught in the school to prison pipeline and aspired to follow my footsteps to Pelican Bay State Prison. When I transferred to UC Berkeley after 2 years after my release, I moved them both with me to get them out of the streets of LA. I encouraged them to pursue a college education and to take advantage of the resources available at Berkeley City College and Laney College. My brother is currently an undergraduate student and co-founder of Underground Scholars Initiative at the University of California, Santa Barbara. My nephew is pursuing an associate degree for transfer in culinary arts at Laney College. My most significant accomplishment was breaking the cycles of incarceration in my family and helping my brother and nephew create their own path toward success. This is what we miss when we lack the courage and the creativity to think outside the recidivism box. Next slide. And that concludes my talk for today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Danny. Our last speaker will be Dr. Boyce.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. I appreciate all that the previous speakers have said. Some of what I'm going to say is going to overlap with what they have said. Next slide, please. So I am a methodologist. So this is not my area of specialization. I'm a program evaluator. I'm an educational researcher as a methodologist. So that's where my expertise really lies. I had the opportunity to be involved with the Education Justice Project, which is a unit within the College of Education at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, led by Dr. Rebecca Ginsburg. And I was a volunteer program evaluator for that project for 2 years. And so that really, that's where a lot of these reflections come from. Next slide. I love this picture taken by John Backman of Ayesha Evans. She's a nurse, and it was as she was getting arrested during a Black Lives Matter protest. And whenever I see this picture, it reminds me of a quote by one of my colleagues, Melvin Hall. He says, "There is no piece of history in the United States that is not colored by race. And as a result, it is such a fundamental part of the DNA of the country that even those elements that it intersects with can't really be talked about without understanding the role that race has played and continues to play in our whole perception of what it is to be a part of the United States, and in fact, what the United States itself is about. And so really where I'm going here is a lot of what Erin has said and what is on the Ben and Jerry's website, this school to prison pipeline, the fact that incarceration is part of white supremacy and directly does come from slavery. And so, when we think about only having recidivism, there's kind of 5 key points to me that makes it problematic, right? The first, as Erin has kind of touched upon, is it fails to consider conditions linked to the many structural inequities of society. We know that there's different population demographics of those who are incarcerated, difference in incarceration rates among various populations, and that there's lots of policies in place, state and federal, why certain people go to prison for certain crimes and others don't. Secondly, it also fails to address those who won't be released. I don't think anybody has talked about that. Oftentimes, there are opportunities for those who won't be released from prison at any point during their life, but there are often really great impacts for them, for their family, even though they won't be released, right? Methodologically, and from my perspective, one of the problematic areas methodologically, and as Erin has alluded to, is that recidivism isn't necessarily the number one reason or the main goal of these college and prison programs. So if you think about it from a program evaluation perspective, you're attempting to match a goal that doesn't necessarily fit onto the original objective of a project, which is methodologically just bad. And as others have said, and I appreciated Danny's comments, the impact on the family members of those of the men and women who are incarcerated, who have participated. And also, I don't think anyone else has mentioned the impact that it has on faculty, the impact that it has on those who participate. So not just the correctional officers, but those who come in from outside of prison and come to teach and come to volunteer. So that's problematic for recidivism being the primary rationale. Next slide, please. So, just thinking through some additional indicators that could be investigated in addition to recidivism is looking at things like self-efficacy, outlook on life, relationship with family, relationships with others who are within the prison. This idea of being able to express yourself, right? Impact on family members. When I was an evaluator for the Education Justice Project, we had an advisory board made up of students who were incarcerated in the Danville Correctional Center. And one of the things that they said that they wanted us to evaluate was the extent to which they became change agents, the extent to which they became educated men, this term that they had. And they had all this criteria for what it meant to be an educated man. And so I think, as Danny also mentioned, the fact that we need to have the voice of those, and again, this is important methodologically as well, the voice of those who are participating in the programs in terms of what they think is important. Certainly recidivism is important, but it is problematic for all the reasons others have expressed as well. Next slide, please. So push it one more time. I don't know why that's in there. So also kind of thinking through, how might we go about this? How might we do this, right? And so I don't want to get too theoretical, but, the fact that we choose to only look at recidivism squarely places us in a certain ontology, and ontology is the extent to which the world is real, right? And so many people believe that there are multiple realities, that there are multiple experiences that you can have, and then there are some that believe there's only reality, there's only black and white, it's hard and back truth. But what we have come to know is that different people have different experiences, and their lived experiences are different than others, and those experiences are often colored by the color of their skin, their nation of origin, their sexual orientation. And if we only try to narrowly focus on one aspect, then we're basically saying that there's only one type of knowledge that counts, or one epistemology that counts. And really what we need to do is expand and broaden our horizons ontologically and epistemologically, which, I don't know, those who are in the academic arena probably care more about than the practical reasons. Also, just methodologically, it makes sense to use a mix of data collection methods, right? We know that when you're able to triangulate data, when you're able to have different types of data that all points to the same kind of answers, then you have more rigor. And only looking at one indicator severely limits that, and only using one type of method severely limits that. And then, as others have said, we need to include multiple stakeholder groups, not only in the planning and what are the outcomes, but oftentimes, people go and they collect data, and then those who have been impacted by the programs or their families never know what the outcomes are. No one ever goes back and says, oh, here are the impacts, or thank you for speaking with us. And so in the reporting, that's quite important as well. And I wrote an article kind of outlining a lot of these thoughts in the critical education volume that Erin mentioned that was published in early 2019. And that is all I have. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. I want to say thank you. As we move in our discussion and Q&A, I want to say thank you to all our speakers for their great presentations today. Kicking off our discussion and Q&A portion of our panel is our invited discussant, Amanda Serrano. Amanda Serrano is a formerly incarcerated woman who participated in higher education throughout the majority of her incarceration, completing an associate's degree through Marymount Manhattan College, while also taking classes through Columbia University towards her bachelor's. Today, she is a certified recovery coach at Anchor Recovery Center and engages in outreach in her community to combat the opioid health crisis. We're really grateful she's agreed to share her reflections of her own experiences with us today, and particularly with regard of how engaging in higher education has impacted her life. So, Amanda, let's move it over to you.
Okay. Hello. Recidivism. I'm an individual. I have 3 DIN numbers. I was a product of my environment. The drug world was glamorized. And so through my 3rd incarceration, I was just so desperate for a better quality of life. And I actually found that through higher education. Prison and college, or college and prison, is so important because it's not just about the recidivism or, not returning back to prison. It genuinely creates a better individual. It instills self-confidence. Like, we do hold ourselves to a higher standard in there, and we do have better prison conduct because we don't want to be viewed as the reason why we're incarcerated. I'm actually the first individual in my family to receive an education. As I shared in the breakout room, I've been home for a little over a year. And over a year, I was able to purchase a home, 2 vehicles. I have just a lot of amazing thing. And all that was instilled through college and prison. The professors, oh my God, the professors just give you a sense of hope. And if you get an A from them, you deserved it. They don't have no pity just because you're an inmate. And I agree with what Katie was reading, how the incarcerated individuals that are in college, they do have more motivation, more drive. Every individual that I had participated in college courses with that is now released, everyone is involved, a large majority is involved in outreach, nonprofit organizations, have their own businesses. It's just through education, it empowered us women to know we are capable of anything that we put our mind to. As I said, it built a self-confidence that just I didn't even know that I had. And to be able to come home and break the cycle. One struggle that I've had since coming home is, yes, I have degrees, I have certifications, I have this. However, I deal with social biasness in the workplace, having trouble finding jobs because, yes, you may have all these great things and be better qualified than somebody else. However, the stigma of being a formerly incarcerated individual does unfortunately carry on, especially returning to the same geographic location where you had committed your crime from. So other than that, yeah, I just believe college and prison is the key to just creating better human beings. Even the individuals that have life without parole, they still pursue college because it gives them a sense of hope, a sense of purpose, a sense of being in a place that's so dark and you're so alone. And it creates a community, you build off, you support each other, you and not all officers are receptive to, they feel like they work 3 doubles and do all this to put their children through school. How are you, an inmate, worthy of a free education? And that's why I always, whenever Hudson Link asks me to do any engagement, anything, I always participate, because I'm so grateful for the opportunity, because I know without a doubt I'm not having a 4th bid today. And that's just, I can say that with confidence. And I just really appreciate the opportunity to sit here and listen to all this, because everybody that I had listened to, you guys are definitely like right on with the compassion, the whole psyche of the inmate, like all that, and the professors. They're amazing. And without them, like, I know I wouldn't be who I am today without my professor, Jane, because she was my academic mentor, and I just appreciate her. So thank you for letting me share. And that's it.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda. So we want to move into the Q&A, the interactive portion of our session. And I saw one question was posed in the chat so far, and so I'll read it out. And I think this is particularly directed towards Amanda and Danny, but if anyone else wanted to speak on it. The question is there any resources or support that you would have wanted from the higher education programs while incarcerated that potentially other students had access to? Sorry, I'm missing the thing. That being incarcerated maybe created a barrier to access. If you were a student, I'm taking this to mean if you were a student not incarcerated, you might have access to those resources, but were there any other resources that you wish that you would have had access to while you were incarcerated?
I honestly had more resources of it. I would have never been able to afford to go to Marymount Manhattan or Columbia University. And Hudson Link, which is like the umbrella for Marymount and everybody in New York, they went over and beyond to provide everything, like even leaving, providing a laptop. And like they call you and they're like, hey, what can we do to help you further your education? Like, you're not forgotten behind. So if anything, I think it depends, because Hudson Link goes over and beyond to provide resources. So I've never felt like I didn't have or lacked what other individuals had. If anything, I feel that we had an advantage, like incarcerated and, having so much attention put on our education.
In my
If I may ask a question, we have a smaller program in Virginia that doesn't have technology access for our students. If you were a student in that environment, and we are not allowed to go in and teach credit classes right now, what would you want to see? We're offering some non-credit programs and a book club. Can you give me any insight as to what you might like to have seen as a student?
I know a lot of students take advantage of even if it's not a non-credited class, because once you start getting a taste for education in there, it becomes like a drug, like a high. You just grasp for any kind of learning, whether it's credited or non-credited. And I know a lot of individuals suffer with the distant learning, and they need the the in-person, but
right.
I feel like if you have the flexibility with them and just let them know that you're persistent as well, because a lot of times I've seen people would get like their syllabus and then that's it. There was no like follow up or, hey, it was just like, oh, they dropped out and they're done. So
right.
I think
the only access we have to our students right now is via JPay emails. We're not allowed to go into the facility, and we're not allowed to have credit classes right now. So we're trying to give them something to be engaged and to move forward and keep that momentum until we can get back inside.
Yeah, JPay, I feel, is definitely going to be your route to getting more people, because they're so, like I said, they have their tablets, so they have the access to these non-credited. But I know I personally participated in every non-credited course I could take just out of boredom, So
what was your favorite topic?
Oh, my favorite topic is about women, what was it? Social issues in class, race, and literature.
Okay,
I love that. Yeah.
that's a good one. That's a good
Yeah.
one. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to circle back to give Danny an opportunity to weigh in on the question as well. If there were any resources that he would wish would have been made available while he was incarcerated and in prison, and in college.
Sure. Yeah, my experience in higher education was in solitary confinement, right? It was like the last 2.5 years of my incarceration, and it was in Pelican Bay State Prison in the security housing unit, and it was all correspondence, right? Everything was done through snail mail. I'd submit my assignments through the mail. What I didn't have access to, and something that we all wanted, was at least access to some type of academic advising. I was taking classes that, I didn't know what an educational plan was until maybe like my last semester, when I got moved into next door to a guy who ended up being my academic mentor. And he's the one that told me about an academic plan and about preparing for AA. And I was just taking class, when I got out, I ended up transferring to Berkeley with about 108 credits, right? And you only really need 70, right? But I was just taking a bunch of classes that I didn't need. So yeah, definitely an academic counselor if that's possible. And that's just to start off, right? There's also support, transition support, right? I would say to the second question regarding the person, she asked a question about, she works in, I think, South Carolina or North Carolina. What can they do to keep students engaged? One thing I would say is, even if you can't teach academic classes right now, start the process of demystifying the university experience, right? A lot of people don't see themselves in these places, especially when you're incarcerated. So maybe thinking about inviting guest speakers that have lived that experience, right? That have lived that experience from incarceration to higher education, and there's plenty of examples all over the country of people that you can invite as guest speakers, especially through Zoom, right? If it's possible, right? But really invite folks to kind of so that the people in there can see someone that was in the same position that they were, right? And are now seeing them, succeed, right? And I think seeing people going through that process, it's a lot more impactful than hearing it from someone who's never experienced what you've experienced.
That's great. We have another question that came through in the chat, and this might be directed more towards Erin and Ayesha, but everyone can weigh in. Are you aware of any research that involves corrections staff and their perspectives on college programs in prison?
I'm laughing over here because we attempted a project like that now about a year ago. And we got IRB approval. We got state approval for a few facilities. And one of the ways, I'll just be completely honest, one of the ways we were approaching this is that COVID had just radically kind of limited some of our plans to do research. And so we were trying to pivot and think, okay, how else can we contribute to this conversation? And we do know that one of the gaps is among officers. We did about 3 interviews and we stopped because the people who we wanted to talk to were not the people who the prison wanted us to talk to. The prison wanted us to talk to programming officers, and anybody who, at least I'll speak for here in Utah and my experience in Illinois, our programming staff are phenomenal. And they'll talk to you about the importance of programming and, how they're committed to it. We wanted to talk to security officers. We wanted to talk to the officers who approve our clearances, who help facilitate non-incarcerated instructors coming in, who have final approval on which students are able to attend classes. And the best that we could get were some mid-range, mid-level officers out of security that it was very clear to us on all 3 interviews that they were not they were prepared to talk about supporting programming, I guess is the best way to say it. And so we realized very quickly that we were not going to be able to get, I don't want to say they were inauthentic views, but they certainly were not the views that those of us who work in prisons each week encounter. And so I would just say from our own experience, it's been challenging.
Thanks so much for that perspective, Erin. Just to kind of go along with what she said, that was our experience. We wanted to look at that in the program evaluation, but we were not given access to those individuals. And I'm not I did a literature review in 2018, and so at that point, at least 3 years ago, I can't say that there were any published research about it at that point.
I will say we have a paper out under review right now that looks at the experiences of folks who are now out, who are on the inside, talking about their engagements with officers. And I think at least that's one angle that we've kind of thought about, but I'd be super curious if other people are engaging this work or have suggestions and ideas.
We have another question that I want to make sure we have time for. So it's asked, are there any suggestions on what college and prison programs should lead with in conversations with DOCs instead of recidivism? Or put another way, like when thinking about stakeholders like DOCs who are primarily concerned with recidivism, what outcomes should we discuss when trying to develop post-secondary education in prisons with them?
I'm going to let my colleagues answer because I don't think people are going to like my answer. My answer is to code switch and to really, if we were to go into the prison here and talk about the humanist potential of post-secondary education with the Utah Department of Corrections, we'd never get in. So I'll stop there and happy to engage that conversation further if folks would like.
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Sure, I'll repeat it. So just any suggestions on what college and prison programs should lead with when they're in conversations with DOCs instead of recidivism? What else, I'm taking this to mean, what else could they emphasize, or what else should they point out or highlight when speaking with DOCs who often are just focused on recidivism?
Right. Yeah, I think that's like their main focus is either recidivism or cost analysis, right? And never really the impact on communities and, really, or the transformation of an individual, right? From someone that was perceived to be a threat to now someone that wants to contribute to society. I think those things are always missed, but then how do you measure that, right? I think qualitative, data, collecting qualitative, collecting stories, right? But it's not, that's really more for public education, right? Usually I feel that administrators they'll listen to the stories, but they don't really make decisions based on the stories and more based on, tangible data, right?
And this may not be in the same line of Erin, what you were talking about, it may not be an answer that's liked very much. And some of the research I've done around other programs of trying to have reduced solitary confinement or trying to have other reforms in prison systems, we found we have to pitch what is the advantage to staff. So if it's going to reduce violence in a facility, or if that's one selling point that we end up having to try and lead with a lot of times to get buy-in from staff. And unfortunately, getting them to see how it can benefit them overall, which isn't really the point, but that's been one strategy.
I can speak about New Mexico if you guys want to hear about that.
Sure.
So we've been doing college in New Mexico for probably over 15, 20 years. We pay for our inmates to go to college, so we probably invest about $200,000 to $300,000 a year for our inmates to go to college. We through local community colleges and most recently we've been working with Ashland University through the Second Chance Pell Grant. We have that in 2 of our facilities with our APDS tablets. But we currently have online schools from a Moodle standpoint in the other 7 of our public facilities as well. And so, but we've been doing college for like I said, 15 or 20 years. We've been paying for it. But it's our biggest push is that we want our inmates to be better people when they get out. 97% of our inmates are getting out at one point, sometime in their career. And so we want them to be better people and better neighbors for all of us. And so it's always been a selling point for that, to where it's never been, unfortunately, or fortunately, I should say, we don't really have the pushback because we've been doing it for so long. So it's a normal just part of education, like adult ed. It's just something that we do. Some of our facilities have more options than others. And we've been really expanding opportunities with Moodle and with other. We're really excited about the new Pell Grants coming out in July of 2023. to really expand those opportunities for our other colleges in the area that we can offer more opportunities for our inmates currently. So right now we have 300 out of 6,000 inmates or 5,600 inmates. We have 350 inmates enrolled in college currently for the semester, which I know isn't a huge number, but once we get the Pell Grants on board, we will be able to greatly expand that just based on that perspective, right now. So most of our inmates are taking 2 to 4 classes a semester. And I think even from our private standpoint, we have MTC out of Chaparral, New Mexico. They pay for 2 college classes from a private prison standpoint for inmates going to prison as well. So, which is unusual to hear that as well. So, but
That's great. We had a hand raise. Jamie Peterson, do you want to ask your question?
Sorry, I was trying to get unmuted. So I'm a dean for corrections education in Aberdeen, Washington for Grace Harbor College. And when you were talking about how to approach it with DOC staff, and I've been doing this work for 15 years inside the facility, first as an instructor and now as the dean. And I will say that is one of the toughest things, because you have that old mindset of, they're inmates, they get what they get, they put themselves here, and what I just try to really support them as these individuals are going to be our neighbors. And the reason I put so much time and effort into the education plan is because they're still human beings, they're someone's loved one, and they might release and move in next door to you, and I try to approach that as, I want to feel comfortable that we've given them all the skills to be productive members of society and to value themselves, put some self-value back into them before they leave us, because I think they're so beaten down by the system itself that I have students tell me, if I couldn't come to education, I don't know what I would do. It's my island of sanity in an insane, place. And so I just try to approach, our management here is really good about supporting programs and not just with lip service, with actual actions to back it up. And so I feel like we're fighting a good battle, and we're winning on behalf of our students. And by we have 2 degree programs here, and now with the legislation that's passed, that anyone, Pell Grant's going to come in 2023. So we're really excited about that. And I think it just gives students that have never been able to program because of their sentence structure, it gives them a sense of belonging and a sense of hope. And so when I am talking to, officers that are less than excited about, the free education, and I said, I'm a taxpayer too, and I would rather my money went to something like this that is positive than to incarcerate more people for longer sentences. But I really try to just approach it from, first of all, it's the right thing to do, And there, but for the grace of God, probably we've all, done something at some point. If, I know a lot of people that, have driven drunk and nothing ever happened and nothing got, but there for the grace of God could be many of our loved ones, or ourselves. And so I just try to tell them, if this guy gets out and he moves next door to me, I'm not going to be scared. I'm going to be thrilled that, hey, look at the skills he has and look at what he can now do with his life, rather than pigeonhole them into, once an inmate, always an inmate. So that's just my 2 cents. And it's, and I always tell people when I do a lot of hiring, and I try to find people that are passionate about helping students to make a positive life when they get out, rather than somebody that knows, English or knows the subject area. Because we can teach them the subject, we can teach them how to teach, but if they don't have that passion and it's just a job and it's just a paycheck, then they really shouldn't do this work.
Thank you so much, Jamie. We have just a few minutes left just to wrap up. And so I just want to give a big thank you again to all of our panelists and speakers today. We really appreciate you sharing your time with us and your own personal experiences, and for all the attendees as well today. We hope this was a fruitful conversation, and I think we could all talk about this this is a very important topic to so many of us. And so we want to close with giving the follow-up contact information for all the speakers today. We're going to drop it in the chat as well, and this will be available afterwards, along with the recording of the slide deck. So if you have any questions or you want to follow up at all, feel free to reach out to any of us. And finally, we just want to remind everyone that this is the first of a 4-part series of webinars that we will be hosting. And so the dates and topics of each of the upcoming webinars are shown here. And we are also dropping in the chat the registration links for each of these webinars. Feel free to attend them and share the registration links widely. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.